It's still going on. I'm sure. So how many we have? Yes. Good morning, all. Before we start our program, I have to do a few housekeeping details because this meeting is actually an official meeting of the City Tree and Green Infrastructure Committee. So as such, we have sort of formal procedures we have to go through. And the first thing I'll start with is just to make a general announcement that, like all city committee meetings, this one is being broadcast. There are many people besides the ones in this room out watching us today, and you can also view it on demand at any time in the future. It's a great setup we have here. I think it's superior to most systems that I've seen in other towns, and I'm very pleased that we offer this. I'd also like to thank the city staff that's here. Joe, our IT expert, we wouldn't be here without his help. And I'm glad to see the mayor here today, so thank you for being part of it. And then the last housekeeping detail is I need to do a roll call of our committee. So please say here when I call your name. Elise Burns?
Present.
Andrea Hoffman?
Here.
Jennifer Duncan?
Here.
And one other committee member will be here momentarily, Katie Downs, and so we do have a quorum and we can formally conduct business. Okay, that's the end of housekeeping. So now I can welcome you all to our program today on creating a yard that benefits people and the environment, also known as lawn alternatives. And I'm Susan Gay. I'm the former chair of the Tree and Green Infrastructure Committee. And I'm very proud of the work our committee does in Rehoboth Beach, both in supporting policy decisions as well as educating the public. And in fact, part of our mission is promoting and sponsoring programs, not only on the tree canopy, but related topics that enhance our environment and provide a network of natural areas and open spaces that sustain clean air and water and provide many benefits to people and wildlife. So this program is right up our alley. Communities across the country, including Rehoboth Beach and all of Sussex County, are losing more green space to impervious surfaces and development every day. But thankfully, many communities are using successful conservation efforts involving less lawn and more native trees and plants, and we should too. That's why we're here today. So today we have two expert speakers who will address a number of topics, including making your landscape more ecologically sound, how to manage and conserve water, how to reduce the demands of lawn care by adding meadow areas, increasing your energy savings with strategically placed plantings, developing your garden as an ecosystem that supports a diverse population of beneficial wildlife and is a natural and healthy habitat. And with that, I'm happy to introduce the first speaker, Tracy Wootten. Tracy is the University of Delaware Horticulture Agent for Sussex County. She received her BS in 1988 and an MS in 1995 from the University of Delaware and is responsible for homeowner and commercial horticulture education. Tracy is also an advisor to the Delaware Nursery and Landscape Association. She handles business risk management programming for the Women in Agriculture program and Annie's Project. And she helps coordinate the Sussex County Master Gardener program with her colleague Megan Pleasanton from Delaware State University. Tracy grew up on a farm near Seaford, Delaware. She enjoys helping her husband with their own vegetable, grain, and poultry farm, spending time with family and friends, as well as volunteering in the community. Welcome, Tracy.
Thank you so much, Sue. It's a real pleasure to be here today, and I brought a lot of handouts. Our main feature is Sue Barton, and she is a professor up at the University of Delaware. She's also the extension ornamental specialist. Sue and I have known each other my entire career. She comes from NC State and has been a wonderful teacher and extension person for us at the University of Delaware. So she's done a lot in her career and has been very instrumental. You'll see the Livable Ecosystems booklet that she has up. I also brought some, but if you look further, there's also the Livable Delaware series, and Sue's been instrumental in creating that 5-book series. So we're talking about trees that can be replaced that are not going to do well here or invasive, to the home landscape. So if you have a situation in your landscape where it's full shade, or maybe it's part sun, coastal, and that's a great publication that actually lists the plants that are going to do well here. And we're going to concentrate today on livable ecosystems. But Sue's been working with DelDOT in the last 20 years to work on reducing mowing and other plantings that can take place to beautify the state. She's been very instrumental in helping us get our landscape architecture major going, so that's been wonderful. And then she is very instrumental in working with the Delaware Nursery and Landscape Association. That association, along as UD, does a huge Hort Expo, so we get not only Delaware, but we'll have 600 people in 2 days for that. And she's been very good at reaching out. I know she's done some things downstate here, down at Bethany, but one of the things just that kind of signifies her abilities is she's won multiple awards with the Nursery and Landscape Association, the Ratledge Service Award at the University of Delaware, and she also won the George M. Warlow Award. And for those of us in the Agricultural College at UD, he's an icon. The epitome of a wonderful person, educator, and Sue represents that award very well. So I'm going to turn it over to her, and we're going to talk about, alternatives in your landscape, and then I have a few things I'm going to share, and we're going to open it to questions. So.
Okay, thank you, Tracy. Let's get rolling. So we have always sort of traditionally selected plants for the landscape based on their decorative value, their aesthetics. Are they providing a screen or a focal point or an anchor? And I'm here to propose that we need to balance that with the environmental benefits that plants can provide in the landscape. They're very important for the food web, pollinator habitat, water recharge, carbon sequestration, all of those things. But notice this is a balance. This is a seesaw. That does not mean that we should ignore the decorative value of plants. We just need to balance that with selecting plants that have environmental benefits. Now, this next image that I'm going to show you is something that Darryl Morrison, he is a landscape architect. He was a professor at the University of Georgia, and I took a class with him for my PhD. And he would have called this a dysfunctional landscape. So I'd like to hear from you all why you think this might be termed dysfunctional.
Okay, you want to take comments from the do we have to have people stand up at the microphone in order to comment, or we just want to have a hand raised?
Well, let's raise our hands here, so yes.
Well, first of all, I see rocks, and it doesn't look like there are any native plants.
Rocks, doesn't look to be native plants.
Yep, none of those are native.
Anybody else?
There's a huge lawn there that's not really providing.
Huge lawn, so that message is getting out. It has its place.
Huge lawn, not providing anything.
No food for birds.
No food for birds.
Absolutely. How about the heating and cooling of that house?
No trees.
No trees.
I wouldn't want to pay that electric bill. And
anything else?
Irrigation system for the lawn.
Irrigation system for the lawn.
yep, that's wasteful. And one other thing, there isn't really a place to be in that landscape. It doesn't create a living space. It simply decorates the corner of the home. Now, I have for years gone to St. Mark's High School for their career day at the end of June, or the middle of June, the end of their semester or school year. And I've represented the career of sustainable landscaping. And that the previous image is my bad slide, and this is my good slide of a functional landscape. And the very first time I presented this, I sort of got the sense from the body language in the room that a lot of the students liked this landscape better. So I stopped and I said, okay, how many people like this landscape better than this landscape? And I would say at least half the class, including the teacher, raised their hand for this landscape. So why do you think that is? Why do you think people responded to this landscape over this one?
Yeah, neat and tidy.
Neat and tidy. That is absolutely true. That kind of sums it up, I think. I mean, there are a few other reasons, but neat and tidy, I think, is probably the biggest one. This landscape looks kind of loose and, you know, people aren't exactly sure how to manage it. Anything else?
Yes, go ahead.
This just looks inviting. You want to go in, it's very peaceful. It just makes you feel better. Like you could walk in that space and go, ah.
Yes, so inviting and
Okay, so
peaceful, a
that's
place
like-
to want to be.
Are you saying that's why you like this one better?
Yes, this one better.
Okay. Okay. So I think the reason that so many young people, and not just young people, chose this one is that it is what they are familiar with. It is pretty much the norm. You know, it's what the house they grew up in looked like, or what their friends' houses look like. Whereas this landscape is different. It is not the norm. I mean, most people have a lawn in their front yard that goes from the street up to their foundation plantings. And this is different. So we sort of came to this desire for the traditional suburban landscape throughout our history. So Frederick Law Olmsted, he was the designer of Central Park in New York City. He said probably the advantages of civilization can be found illustrated and demonstrated under no other circumstances so completely as in some suburban neighborhoods where every family abode stands 50 or 100 feet or more apart from all others and at some distance from the public road. And what he doesn't say, but what he means is, and it is surrounded by a lawn. So, you know, that is sort of the suburban dream. That's what people strived for. And so it's not surprising that that is the way many people respond when they see a landscape. I am here to tell you that that is changing. So we will see how that transpires as the talk goes on. But if you have that standard traditional suburban lawn and landscape, as we've been talking about, unfortunately, it doesn't generate all the ecosystem services you need to survive. And so you've got to borrow those services from someplace else. And unfortunately, in the state of Delaware, we have fewer and fewer someplace else's as we continue to develop more and more of suburbia. And, you know, when we develop, it often looks like this, where the primary vegetation in the landscape is lawn. So what are those ecosystem services we need? We need clean water, and we need to manage the water quantity as well. We need high air quality, and plants do a good job if they are biodiverse in filtering out pollutants and exchanging carbon dioxide for oxygen, which living things, you know, the rest of the animal kingdom needs. We need pollination services and wildlife habitat. And we also need to be engaged in the landscape for our physical and mental health. So we'll get back to these as we progress through the talk. But I showed you that image before of all of the lawns, and most of this development is landscaped traditionally, except for the one house. So this house that's landscaped with forest and meadow and landscape beds and lots of native plantings. It is actually providing a significant number of those ecosystem services, as opposed to the rest of those homes that really aren't doing a very good job of providing those ecosystem services. So this was a study that Doug Tallamy and I did at Winterthur a number of years ago, where we looked at 3 different types of landscapes. We looked at the lawn, we looked at a meadow, and we looked at a forest, and we counted insect species. That's what we're doing here. We're on transects and we're counting the number of insects that we find in a square foot. And then we also looked at bird diversity, and we looked at plant species diversity. And not surprisingly, the least diverse of the 3 landscapes was the lawn. The next best was the meadow, and of course the forest was the most diverse. And it is that biodiversity in both plants and animals that provide those necessary ecosystem services. Does that mean we shouldn't have lawn in the landscape? Well, no, it doesn't mean we shouldn't have lawn, because lawn is really the only vegetation we can walk on. So if you want to be able to walk through your landscape, you either need to have stepping stones or you need to have lawn pathways. So lawn is very useful for that purpose. It also makes a nice gathering space. You're not going to sit down and read a book in the middle of a meadow. You wouldn't feel comfortable doing that. And it provides a place for recreation. You can't really toss a football in the middle of the forest. So lawn does provide a very important function in the landscape. It just doesn't need to be this big. There is absolutely nothing that I can think of that would require you to have a lawn this large, unless you wanted to have 2 simultaneous football games in your front yard. But other than that, I just can't understand the need for that much mowed lawn space. So if you had that kind of a configuration, you could have a meadow in your front yard instead. Notice that in this landscape, they have mowed the edge of the driveway, and that is what makes this meadow attractive and acceptable and look well managed. And we'll get back to that a little bit later. So meadows will provide much better water management, because water is much more likely to infiltrate rather than run off when you have taller grass. It reduces nutrient pollution to water bodies because the water is allowed to infiltrate. It supports more wildlife, and you don't have to go out and cut it all the time. So it saves time and energy. And I propose it actually looks a lot more attractive than a huge mowed lawn would look. So we have to change the traditional suburban design paradigm. We need to get people to think differently about their landscape. So landscapes shouldn't just be a decoration for the front of the house. They should actually create a space in which people can live. So here, there's a lawn in the front yard, but the lawn is surrounded by landscape beds in a way that creates a living space right there in the front lawn. So here's the old way. Here's the sort of traditional suburban landscape. And this is using a computer program called SketchUp to model what that landscape could look like if more plantings were added and you created a space within that front lawn. Here's another, this is a real example. And in this case, the front lawn is really just a wide path that leads you through the rest of the landscape. So there is a development in North Wilmington. It's very close to Winterthur off of Route 52. It's called Applecross, and Jules Brooke, a colleague of mine who taught landscape design, she just left UD this past year to be the director of the landscape architecture program at the University of Florida. But she took this photo soon after Applecross was built, And the developer included a number of things in this development that were sustainable landscape features. There are bioswales instead of stormwater drains, and the deeds to the houses say that you have to maintain this meadow zone between your mowed backyard and this forest buffer, which is what is surrounding a stream that flows through the development. And so Jules and I were both using this photo in lectures, and we said one day, let's go out to Applecross and get some different photos to use of this phenomenon. And when we got there, we found out that people were not maintaining that meadow strip any longer. They didn't feel like they owned the property unless it was mowed. So people had started mowing their backyards all the way up to the tree line, even though their deeds told them not to do that. So that kind of got us interested in launching a demonstration project at Applecross. And we approached this homeowner since they didn't have a lot of landscaping in, I mean, they had the foundation plantings, but they didn't have a lot of other landscaping. And so we said, we would like to re-landscape your house in a sustainable way, and we will manage it for 3 years and then turn it back over to you. And we brought people out to give them tours during that process and took a lot of photographs. So our goal was to cut the lawn space in half. It's an acre, so there were about 44,000 square feet of lawn. We wanted to cut that down to about 22,000 square feet of lawn, and add native plantings, fix some stormwater management issues, improve wildlife habitat, and try to get the homeowners more engaged in the landscape. They didn't really use their landscape. And so if you're not going to have lawn, you really have sort of 3 other options. You can have landscape beds, you can have a forest, or you can have a meadow. Now, very few people argue with landscape beds, which is one of the things we added at Applecross. We added landscape beds around the areas, just like I showed you before, to create lawn spaces that were purposeful. But landscape beds are the most expensive of the options. So we're going to get to forest and meadow in just a little bit, but let's explore landscape beds a little further. This was the side yard of this house, and really there was absolutely no reason to go there unless you were cutting the grass. That's the only reason that this family went into their side yard. And so we added a whole bunch of plantings and created a pathway system so that it would encourage people, both the homeowners as well as their guests, to walk through the landscape. And this is what it looked like a couple years into the landscaping process. So instead of just having that lawn that doesn't entice you at all, now there's this winding path that kind of makes you want to know what's at the other end. So I want to talk a little bit about pollinator habitat as an important ecosystem service. And while people were filing in, I heard some of you talking about Doug Tallamy and his talks. And this is a little series of images from Doug. And he's talking about here how this Phlox divaricata is a lovely plant to have in your garden. It spreads by seed, but it only spreads by seed if it's pollinated. And it has a very deep corolla. So the only way to pollinate it is to get an insect with a long proboscis to stick its proboscis down into that corolla and pull the pollen out. This happens to be a snowberry clearwing. It's an insect with that long proboscis. So it pulls out the pollen and takes that pollen to another plant. Well, the only way to get snowberry clearwings in your garden is to have the food that the larva of the snowberry clearwing eats, and that food is native honeysuckle. So if you want snowberry clearwings, and in order to pollinate your phlox, you have to have native honeysuckle somewhere in your garden. And this is just one of hundreds of thousands of relationships that exist between very specialized insects and the plants that they can eat. And we can't possibly understand all of those specific relationships. Well, we could possibly understand them, but it would just take a long time to figure them all out. And so therefore, it's a good policy to try to include as many native plants as you can in your landscape, in the hopes that you will be fulfilling many of those specialized relationships. Now, one of the ecosystem services that I mentioned in the very beginning that a lot of people don't necessarily think about, although I have to say COVID-19 has brought this ecosystem service much more to the forefront of societal thinking. As people couldn't go to movie theaters and couldn't go out to restaurants for a while, people started to realize how important it was to engage in the natural world and go for hikes and walks and do the kinds of things that were safe early on in the pandemic. And so this human engagement with the outdoors is something that I think a lot more people appreciate now than they did prior to the start of the pandemic. What this slide is illustrating, this is back to the Applecross garden. And in the third year of this garden, we hired some student interns to help us with the weeding that we had promised this homeowner that we would do. And they would go out every 2 weeks and weed the garden. And you can see here in the middle, these winterberry hollies are starting to fruit. And the students would keep Jules and me appraised of, what was happening in the garden. And they were starting to notice the winterberry holly fruit. But then one day they came to the garden and it looked like this. And they were just dumbfounded at how beautiful the winterberry hollies looked in relation to the tan grasses and some of the dark green eastern red cedar and other evergreens in this photo. And they took this photo and texted it to us right away, and we're just thrilled with how beautiful this landscape looked. And that has always sort of resonated with me as an important touchstone. We could have taught those students in a plant materials class that winterberry holly has beautiful red berries and it looks especially nice in the winter when all the rest of the leaves have fallen off. But them experiencing it themselves in a landscape that they were managing is a way to learn that way better than learning it in any class. So that's kind of what I mean by engagement, getting people engaged in the landscape. In this case, it was several students. This is actually another student project. We had a student design what we felt was a very traditional landscape, plants decorating the base of the house, a little bit of screening around the periphery of the property. And then we had them design something that would really change the paradigm. And the idea here is the lawn is so important. Design it first. Put areas of lawn in the front yard where you want to sort of set off the rest of the plantings. Have lawn in the backyard where you've got a gathering space. It provides a way to spill off from the deck if you've got a big party. It provides access to the vegetable garden. There could be part of the landscape that's a meadow, and the lawn provides a pathway around that meadow. And then everything else can become something else. Now, if you remember back to one of my earlier slides, it can become a landscape bed, it can become a meadow, or it can become a forest. So here is once again an image of the traditional landscape. And this is what it could be if you design the lawn where you need it and then let everything else sort of be something else. So let's look at the alternative of meadow. This is a development in southeastern Pennsylvania. It's right out 896 from Newark, Delaware. And this developer was required to take half of their land where they could build homes, and the other half had to be saved as or preserved as open space. This could have been mowed lawn, which would have been a maintenance liability for the communities. They would have had to pay someone to mow that area. Instead, it was seeded as a meadow, and paths are mowed routinely through that meadow. And the community now uses that space to walk their dogs or go on walks themselves. It's even large enough that people can run in that in that meadow area. So this is a very large meadow, but meadows don't have to be large. In this case, this is a very small backyard meadow where there's a mowed area for recreational purposes, and the rest of the lawn is allowed to be a meadow with, very importantly, a path mowed through it. Now, this image is not a meadow at all, obviously. It's a mowed lawn backyard. This is a home that's on a street that I pass every day on my way to and from work. And these are white pines that at one time probably did a really nice job of screening this backyard from what is a fairly busy road. But because pines tend to limb up, they're not really providing any kind of screen any longer. And so the people, you know, as people drive by this house, they can look right into the backyard. So what I would propose is that these homeowners not get rid of the pines, but plant a meadow of switchgrass around the base of these pines. And it could look something like this. Now, this is Canaltown Park in Lewis, but it's the same concept with trees growing out of this switchgrass mass. So imagine this switchgrass and go back to that. And if there were switchgrass around the base of those trees, wouldn't that backyard feel so much more protected and enclosed and desirable? Okay, so this is not a meadow. This is a home where they have stopped mowing the grass. And in fact, in the city of Newark, that will get you a citation because you are required to mow your lawn. So a meadow, in order for it to be a meadow, it actually has to have some cues that people are caring for that meadow, and it has been planted purposefully as a meadow. This small front yard, on the other hand, is clearly a meadow, and the main signal here is the mown path. So one of the best ways to indicate that you are purposefully caring for a meadow is to mow a path through that meadow. So here are some examples of cues of care: mowed path, stepped mowing, which just means mowing, say, the path every week, a zone maybe every 6 or 8 weeks, and then leaving the rest of the meadow to be mown just once a year. Clearly mowing the edges of your meadow, adding perennials at the edges or at intersections of paths, adding artwork, and adding, if you've got a public place, you could actually put up a sign telling people that you have purposely left this grass as a meadow. Now, this is a landscape design. This is actually my sister's home, and she had her landscape designed by Larry Weiner Associates. It's a firm up in Pennsylvania, which is where she lives. And here's the edge of her house, this gray thing, and here's her driveway. Oops. I shouldn't have clicked on that. All right, here's her driveway. And they designed this little area of lawn. She wanted a meadow in her front yard, and they designed this little area of lawn. And my sister said to me, I don't want that lawn in my front yard. I want the meadow to go right up to the edge of this walkway. And I said, Janet, you're not going to like that. It is not going to look good to have the meadow come right up to your walkway. It's going to feel uncomfortable to walk down that walkway into your front yard. And she said, okay, well, then I'll let them put in this planting bed, and this gray thing is a retaining wall. And she said, but I just want the meadow to come right up to the edge of the planting bed. And I said, that's not going to look good either. That transition between the meadow and the mulched bed is going to look sloppy and awkward. This little piece of lawn is actually critical for making the whole rest of this design work. And so understanding that, understanding where lawn will make such a difference in a landscape is part of accepting this new design paradigm. So here we see a mowed edge. I showed you this image earlier, and that is what is making this look like a purposeful meadow. It's not that they just forgot to mow this hillside. They are purposely leaving it as a meadow, and but routinely mowing the edge. Now, this is actually not a meadow. It's a little perennial border. This is the Kalmar Nickel site in downtown Wilmington. But I think it's a good example of how important a mowed edge can be. I think if this perennial border went all the way up to that driveway, people would find that messy and unattractive. But because there's this neat mowed edge of turf, this border can be looser and more open and can have a variety of different perennials in it. So with meadows, the whole idea here is to really celebrate the plants that do well in meadows in our climate. And little blue stem is a great example of that. It is a plant that will come in to a meadow on its own. Often, if you just stop mowing, it turns this beautiful apricot color in the fall. And if you have little blue stem, it's really, really fortunate. Little blue stem doesn't grow necessarily everywhere. It depends on the soil that you have. It depends on whether there's a seed source nearby. So the first way to get a meadow is to just stop mowing and see what you get. So here's a backyard where they just stopped mowing. They're just mowing a path here. That's to show that it's purposeful. And what they got initially is simply tall, cool season grasses. So the same grasses that are in the lawn, you stop mowing them and they're going to grow taller. But within a couple of years, some other plants will start moving in. You get things like Queen Anne's lace, very opportunistic perennial or biennial that will move into a newly unmown landscape. You could get grasses like red top will move in fairly quickly. And then within a couple of years, if you're lucky, you might get a beautiful stand of common milkweed. This was not planted, it just came into this landscape. And so allowing the grass to just grow taller and see what comes in is probably the easiest way to establish a meadow. But it's variable. You won't know what you're going to get until you try it. You do have to manage the invasive plants that might come in. And you could do that by mowing once a year, of course, but you also might have to do some spot treatment to keep undesirable plants out of a meadow with this strategy. So the next most involved method of creating a meadow is to seed it. And that's what we did at Applecross in the back corner of the property. We seeded a meadow, we mowed a little path in, we mowed a circular gathering space, and we mowed a path back out. This is primarily Indian grass, nice native grass with butterfly weed and black-eyed Susan and several other plants mixed in. When you seed a meadow, you need to be careful about setting expectations. If we go back to Applecross, this is primarily grass, and that is a sustainable meadow. You need to have a strong grass backbone in your meadow. This is AstraZeneca. They had taken a lot of land out of mowing, which is great, and they created various different types of landscapes, one of which was this seeded meadow. The trouble is, this seeded meadow is seeded with a lot of annuals that are not native, like this purple cosmos, and those annuals have to be reseeded every year. The first couple of years, they might reseed themselves because there will be soil exposed, but as the meadow develops and gets thicker, they won't reseed any longer because only the seed that touches soil germinates. And so the people that work in this office building have kind of been sold a false bill of goods. They look out their windows and they see all these beautiful flowers, and that might last for the first couple of years, but that meadow is not going to continue that way unless it is reseeded and somebody is continuing to add flowers to the meadow. So it's important to set people's expectations appropriately when establishing a meadow. The most intensive way to establish a meadow is to actually plant it. This is at North Creek Nursery. They grow plugs, and so they made a demonstration garden using plugs to plant a meadow. One of the things you can do with plugs or plants, that you plant, could be quartz or gallons even, is you can create a pattern or a mosaic with your meadow. So here they have a mass of goldenrod, they have another mass of asters, they have a mass of switchgrass. In the background, there's a section of silphium or cup plant. So they're controlling where the different plants are in the landscape. When you establish a meadow, when you seed a meadow, one of the things that we learned in our DelDOT work was that you do have to get rid of the existing vegetation. So I started off this process of establishing a meadow by saying that the easiest way is to just stop mowing, and eventually different things will come in. But if you want to add seed, you have to add seed to bare soil. You can't add seed to existing growing vegetation. This is in Milford, and on the right side of this sort of center line here, we cut the existing vegetation low, but we didn't kill it, and we seeded our meadow mix into it. On the left of this line, we killed the existing vegetation and we seeded our meadow mix into it. Now, 3 years down the line, what you see on the left is all of the warm season grasses that were part of the meadow mix. What you see on the right is the cool season grasses that were there all along, and almost none of the grasses or perennial forbs that we seeded. So our seeding really didn't take well if we didn't kill the existing vegetation. Now, I do have to say that 10 years later, that whole area is filled with these warm season grasses. So eventually the warm season grasses spread, but most people don't want to wait 10 years for their seeded meadow to become established. My favorite way of spreading seed is to spread it in some sort of organic medium. That medium does two things. It keeps the seed moist. So once it rains, the medium becomes moist, and then it will be a good germination medium for the wildflower meadow seed. But probably even more important, if you get about a 1/2 inch layer of some organic medium, it will exclude light from reaching the seeds that are in the soil. And there are a couple of problem plants, annuals, crabgrass and foxtail, that are real plagues of a young meadow. And those seed require light to germinate. So if you can prevent those seed from germinating, you will have a much healthier meadow sooner. So on the top image here, we use mushroom compost as our medium. There's a lot of mushroom compost, of course, in Kennett Square and the nearby area. And so we thought we would try to see how that worked. And in the bottom image, we use sawdust. And the sawdust really works much better because the mushroom compost starts out moist, and it's much harder to spread. It clumps up in the manure spreader, whereas the sawdust spreads very easily when it's dry. And also the sawdust is basically inert, but the mushroom compost contains fertilizer. It contains nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium, and those components, while they fertilize the seed that, the meadow plants that we've planted, they also fertilize the weeds. And we found that they give an advantage to the weeds, since most of our meadow plants will tolerate a very low fertility soil. So here's the process that we used in Applecross. Step 1 was to kill the existing vegetation. And then step 2, this is actually a different project, but it's to take the sawdust and spread it out on a hard surface, and then spread the seed over the site. Meanwhile, somebody back here is core aerating the site that you are planning to spread the meadow mix onto. Then you take a front end loader and you mix up the sawdust completely. The sawdust and seed are completely mixed. Now, if you're doing this on a very small scale, you can do this with a wheelbarrow and a shovel. You don't need to have a front end loader. So we've got this person up here core aerating the meadow area. And then you go ahead and spread that sawdust seed mix. Some of it falls down into the holes that you've just pulled out with the core aerator, and some of it is just on the surface, but it will then germinate in about a week or 2 weeks. This was about 2 weeks after we seeded, and you can see a lot of our grasses up. These larger plants were plants that we planted from plugs. And then this was about a month later. The meadow's growing in beautifully, and this is what the meadow looked like the very first fall. All of that Indian grass is blooming. Okay, so how do you maintain a meadow? We've already talked about those cues of care that are absolutely critical, mowing the paths or the edges. But you do need to mow a meadow once a year in order to prevent woody plants from moving in. In the Midwest, where prairies are the climax vegetation, nobody is out mowing those meadows yearly. They are just maintaining themselves. But on the East Coast, our climax vegetation is actually an oak hickory forest. At least it is in the Piedmont, but it's still a forest even in the coastal plain. And so in order to maintain a meadow, we have to stop the successional process, and we have to mow it once a year. The time to mow the meadow is after the winter. A couple of reasons. One is that all of the seeds have matured, and some of them were eaten by birds, which is great, and some of them have fallen to soil and will germinate again. But the other reason is that the winter kind of beats down the meadow, and it's much easier to mow at this point than it would be while the grasses were still vertical. So this was a community, 55 and older community in Newark that I was working with on some of their landscape. They had a lot of public areas, and they mow trails through these areas. This is clearly in the fall, the goldenrod is blooming, and I was walking along this trail with the landscape committee, and all of a sudden we came upon the landscape contractor who's mowing down the meadow at the height of its beauty. And we came to discover that Newcastle County had a regulation that said meadows must be mown every 3 times a year. So meadows in public spaces like this. And that is completely wrong from a horticultural perspective. And so fortunately, Dennis Petrozzulli was the chair of the landscape committee. And he went to battle with Newcastle County. He got a letter from me stating, the appropriate mowing times, and he actually got the regulation in Newcastle County changed. And this is some photos that he had sent me later of what their meadows looked like in the fall as unmown meadows. So this whole concept of meadows as desirable components of the landscape is something that is really being accepted more and more these days. Some of you might recognize this is the New York City High Line. And when the High Line is just this abandoned rail line, it's about 1.5 miles of elevated rail. And when they abandoned it, all kinds of plants came in on their own, and there was a meadow growing up there. New York City was going to tear it down, and some people decided that it was too beautiful to tear down and that they needed to make it a park. And in New York City style, of course, they raised billions of dollars and created what is now considered the most visited public garden in the world. But it has quite a different aesthetic from most public gardens. So Pete Udolph, who designed the perennial plantings for the High Line, really took his inspiration from the plants that had come in there on their own, a lot of little blue stem and eupatorium and things like that. And he used grasses and other plants to sort of recreate that aesthetic in this planned planting. So all those millions of visitors that go to the High Line every year are starting to see this as a viable and desirable kind of landscaping. Longwood Gardens is also a place that has a lot of impact. And when they opened up their meadow for visitation, which was part of a project that involved moving Route 52, which used to bisect their meadow. When 52 was moved to the other side of the meadow, they had this large contiguous meadow that they could then interpret by having paths and bridges and instructional signs throughout the meadow. And if you had told the administration of Longwood when they embarked on this project what would eventually happen, they would have never believed you. The meadow has become the most visited location at Longwood. So more people come to Longwood and are interested in going and seeing the meadow than any other specific garden within Longwood Gardens. So that says a lot about how people feel about meadows. And of course, you all have a Pete Udolph meadow in your own backyard. This is in Dagsboro. And the Delaware Botanic Garden has this beautiful meadow that was designed by Pete Udolph and is managed by a really wonderful corps of volunteers, which is necessary for keeping a meadow like this, which is based on having a mosaic of specific plant masses. This is not a meadow that would be sustainable without a fair amount of effort in keeping it looking the way it looks, but it is quite beautiful. So meadows can be at big public gardens, but they can also be at individual homes. So this is a couple who retired from farming. They have a house in Middletown, Delaware, and they came to visit me, asking me for my advice in how to get a meadow in their front yard. And the image on the left is the photo they sent me the very first year. That was their young meadow. And then several years later, they sent me these other two images to show me how much the meadow had grown. And they really enjoyed seeing these grasses all winter long. In fact, they wondered how long they could keep the grasses up without having to mow them. Here's another backyard meadow. This is a friend of mine who keeps bees, and he planted this meadow of buckwheat in his little suburban backyard as forage for his bees. He has since planted it to a much more diverse meadow, which is more sustainable than planting buckwheat, but the buckwheat was pretty. This is near Longwood Gardens. It's another retirement community. Jim Swayze, who's a retired professor at the University of Delaware, lives there, and he invited me up one day he actually invited me to speak to their group up there. But he showed me around the site first, and he said, this meadow with the path mowed through it is so attractive and interesting that this row of houses at the top of the meadow and a similar row of houses at the bottom of the meadow are the most desirable and the most expensive homes in the community because everyone wants to look out on the meadow. So I think we are starting to make some inroads into this concept that we don't need to have acres and acres of mowed lawn, that people actually appreciate the biodiversity and the interest that can be created in different types of landscapes like meadows. We advertised this program as talking about water management, and I really didn't have time to get into water management much, but I wanted to end with this little vignette about a project also close to you all. This is in South Bethany. I worked with the Center for Inland Bays on this project. As you probably realize, when it rains and the water flows off the street carrying oils and other pollutants, and when it flows off people's yards and carries fertilizer, it very quickly makes its way into the inland bays. And so the idea of this project was to slow that down. An engineering firm was involved, and the engineering part of the solution was to widen widen these ditches to give more time for the water to infiltrate. And my part of the project was to add plants to do the same thing, to give more time for infiltration. Now, Sea Colony was very concerned about this. People spend a lot of money to have these condos and to be at the beach, and they wanted to make sure it looked good. And so, they wanted to keep their petunias by the entrance. But we planted this native planting. We had a no-mow zone on the street side of the ditch, and we planted a lot of water-loving plants on the other side. And we definitely slowed the water down. And what was really interesting to me was after a couple of years of this growing in, it really looked quite beautiful. And Sea Colony came back to us and they said, you know what, we were totally wrong about our concerns. The people who live in this community love this landscape. We get so many good comments about it because it looks like the beach. I mean, it looks like the place that folks are going to for vacation. They don't want to see something that looks artificial. They want to see a natural landscape. So with that, I'm going to close, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
If there are questions, then since the meeting is being broadcast, people need to come up to the microphone to ask them, but, or else you
Questions
would
for
need to
Sue?
repeat them.
This on?
Yes, it is, yes. I think you just turned it off.
No?
Yeah.
There it is.
Okay.
Charlie Garlow, 82 Sussex Street in Rehoboth Beach. Have you thought about or counseled people on pesticides? Roundup recently I just lost it again, I guess. Hello?
You can come use this one. Come over here, no worries.
We have trouble with that one sometimes. Okay.
Roundup is a pesticide widely used and recently lost some lawsuits over the issue of cancer and stuff. So that's the human impact, but I'm wondering about the impact on the bugs and the butterflies and all the rest of the things that we see as the part of the web of life. Have you got thoughts on that topic?
So, I mean, Roundup is an herbicide. So an herbicide is going to be very specific to targeting plants and won't hurt insects and microbes. While Roundup or glyphosate definitely is effective at killing plants, it doesn't particularly harm insects or birds or other wildlife. The jury is definitely still out on glyphosate. The lawsuits against glyphosate were very much driven. The decisions were made by people that were not scientists, that didn't necessarily have the facts. There were a lot of lawyers convincing people of things that aren't necessarily true. So I'm not going to get into a big debate about glyphosate today, but if somebody is concerned about using glyphosate, there are other ways of killing vegetation. By excluding light is probably the simplest, as far as if you're not interested in using any kind of a chemical herbicide. That's harder on a large scale. In that case, allowing a meadow to develop by just letting the stopping mowing is probably your best strategy, and seeing what happens and managing for the invasives that come in.
And I'll tag on there. For years, I've been doing this for 33 years. I've been using integrated pest management, or IPM, all my life. And most people in the green industry and in the agricultural community use it and have been for 30, 40 years. And what that is identifying your pest, where it is in the life cycle. Can you do something about it now, or do you need to wait? And then in extension, we are non-biased. We do not provide one company over another or product over another. We educate everybody from the least toxic to where you are, what you need. And so like bagworms on evergreens, on arborvitae and Leland cypress. To do anything right now is futile. It's not going to do anything. You're going to wait until next June, and the second to third week of June, after the bagworms have hatched, and then make an application, which you can use a bacterial side at that point in time, and it's very, very effective. As you get later in the season, before they turn into the bag, you would need to use a different type of pesticide. Now, you can also hand pull those off right now. Don't throw them on the ground, because they need to be thrown away. But there's a lot of different, and what we try to do, and like Sue says, is to educate people. What are your options? You get to choose what's right for you. Next question. I know someone had one. Yeah.
Yes, good morning. So I wanted to thank you and everybody here today for providing this forum. As an individual homeowner, and there's a lot of communities popping up all over Sussex County, And with those communities are retention ponds. And I'm curious to know whether anybody has done anything or is coordinating with anybody on a community basis to sort of do meadows around retention ponds as a way not only to naturalize the community, but I know communities are looking for a way to manage the geese population as well. And
Yeah,
is there
so
any
that's a fabulous point about managing geese. I know in Newcastle County, I'm not as familiar with the regulations in Sussex County, but in Newcastle County, they have moved dramatically away from stormwater ponds, and they have moved to vegetative rain gardens or bioretention facilities. That is a way of dosing water back into the ground gradually, which is much more effective. It's mimicking the natural process that occurs when there's a lot of land available. And it solves the geese problem because geese only land on short grass or paved surfaces. Geese don't land in a meadow. So if you want to manage geese, having a meadow around a retention facility, or simply having it be a planted rain garden instead of a big stormwater pond. What you have to do is have multiple small rain gardens throughout versus one big retention pond. But then you get desirable landscaping throughout the community. And you don't waste the space on sort of a big, ugly retention pond. But I know that Newcastle County has passed legislation to require that. And I don't think that that is the case yet with Sussex County.
No, I can speak to that as well. If you don't want geese in your pond, do a vegetated buffer all the way around. People are starting to do that. I know for a fact I have a pond at my house. I did used to let 2 pair of geese nest because it was far enough away from my house, but that became problematic, and I no longer mow completely down. If they have to walk through tall grass like that, they're not gonna go in the pond. You can put up filament lines, you can do all that, it's not gonna work. And yes, we are working. I just had a short meeting with DENREC yesterday, and some of my colleagues. We've been visiting different sites and HOAs to talk about ways of either reduce mowing, meadows, and as Sue has said today, part of that is an acceptance of something different. And I can't say enough, managing expectations is huge. And we're trying to work with some people, maybe doing some smaller areas so that people can see what it would look like and get used to that and see if that's something they want to do, or do they want to pay to mow all the time. And so it's very, very important. And the other thing is being able to go out and look at those sites that maybe you use fine fescue and it's only mowed once a year in certain areas to establish and maintain areas for erosion, things like that. So yes, that is going on, and was talking with DEMREC about a couple of sites that they're willing, to put money behind for us to educate. We've been doing it at a smaller site. The other thing I will tell you, we also have been working with meadows at our office in Georgetown, which is at the Carville Research and Education Center. And when Sue showed Pete's beautiful meadow at the Botanic Gardens, we have a very small area, and some of our volunteers were very succinct in where they wanted plants. They did the mosaic, and then we had extra plants left over, and we literally went 5 feet over and just put whatever we had extra in. And I'm going to be honest with you, in July, you couldn't tell the difference. They were both gorgeous. So, a lot of this is trial and error, and that's, like Sue did, and we're trying to do some things at the office as well. One of the things that I'm going to look at this year is actually pollinating mixes that you would use for solar panels. And so there's some at different heights, because I know some people don't like wild and woolly. But if it truly stays at 2 feet, is that acceptable? Again, with a mowed edge. And the one thing I used to tell people, I had a colleague, I said, look, Bill, you mow with intent. If you don't mow with intent and put that edge there, people think you just walked away and you're not being judicious and neighborly. And they're like, oh, yeah. So, that was one of the cues of care that Sue talked about are beyond important. Showing people that you're still maintaining that area. But signage in a new area to educate others is huge as far as acceptance. And knowing that that area is going to change. Like Sue said, over time, it is going to change. Well, to me, that's part of the beauty of waiting to see what happens next and a good selling point. But that's just me. Other questions? I think we had another hand. Yes.
Thank you for this presentation. It's been great. I had a question. We rebuilt our house, and so the front yard is where we parked for over 30 years, and I can't dig it all in there. So what is the first step in terms of how to deal with basically a construction site to make it into a pollinator habitat? So what do I need to do to the soil so we can actually start planting?
Okay.
So the thing you should do is you should bring in a load of compost and as best you can till that a little bit into the soil. I like to tell this story. So Tom Sims was a soils professor in the Plant and Soil Sciences department, and then he became an administrator for the college. And as an administrator, he moved into Christiansted, a development in Newark, a relatively new development at the time. And he asked me to come out to his house and give him some landscaping advice. Since he was an administrator, I said, of course. And actually, I would have said, of course, to any colleague. But he had a builder's package to spend on planting. Or a builder's allotment, and he wanted my advice on what he should plant. And when I came out to his house and took one look at his property, I said, Tom, you just need to spend all that money to get compost in and mix that into the soil now before you plant anything else, because that is going to make the biggest difference in the success of anything you plant later on. And he looked at me and he said, oh, I was kind of thinking about azaleas and dogwoods. And I said to myself, oh my gosh, my career is over. I cannot even convince a soil scientist that he needs to spend money on compost. So what luck do I have with the general public? But it is absolutely true that getting that soil right in the beginning is absolutely critical for the rest of the landscape. And from your own experience that when it's compacted like that, not very much will grow. So you don't need to, if you're trying to grow a meadow, you don't need it to be the richest soil in the world, but you do need it to be looser than what it is now. And a load of compost will go a long way towards helping.
A front loader going down 2 feet, or what would you recommend?
Well, the more you can break it up, the better. So if you can get a large piece of equipment in there to actually break up the soil, that would be great. A lot of people only have access to, a rototiller, and that's not going to do too much. But even just mixing the compost into the top couple of inches will start to improve the soil.
Sue, I was holding up a soil test kit for UD, and I brought these. You pay for it when you bring it back. But one of the things I wanted to share is that for whatever reason, we are finding very, very low pHs. So if your pH is low, you could have nutrients in the soil and your plants don't have access to it. It's unavailable. But what we found, I actually came and did a site visit with a green industry person for an old oak tree. And nothing major, some limbs that needed to be taken out. But I did a soil test while I was there. It came back at 4.6, which is like blueberries like that and not much else. So doing a soil test in your existing landscape, our soils tend to be acidic, so we recommend every 3 years you do a soil test. They're $17, but you get 3 recommendations depending on what you want. So if you wanted a lawn, they're gonna give you what you need to do to bring that pH where it needs to be. If you wanna do landscape beds with plants in it, shrubs, they'll give you that as well, and maybe a vegetable garden, depending on what you have. But this is key, and that's, you know, they had a service come in, take those limbs out, but then they also are applying lime to bring their pH up where it needs to be so the tree can remain healthy. And so that's very crucial, and we're just seeing that a lot this year. So from something that should be 6 to 6.5 is now 4.6. It's like 100-fold how acidic it actually is. So very important for that. So that's why I brought these. And it also will, if you haven't had a soil test, that's something else you could do. But the compost here in Sussex County for the compacted clay that you get after construction will make it a better soil. If you have low pH, compost tends to be at a neutral 7, so it's going to help bring that up. But also when we do construction, we're taking subsoil, which is very acidic and has very low microbial activity, and mixing it with our topsoil many times. So then that changes it. So you definitely want to do what's there now so you know what you're working with. So. Any other questions today? Sure.
One thing that, hi, my name is Catherine Burgwin, and I actually live on the west side of Route 1. But one thing that I notice, and this may be too hot of a topic to talk about globally, but I just want your opinion. When I see new construction being done, a lot of times the whole property is denuded, and a couple of big trees may be circled to save, and then there's digging that takes the whole root system out of that particular property. What is going to happen to those big trees that supposedly are being saved with that small 15-foot parameter around them? Will they survive without their root systems?
I think you probably know the answer to that
Okay.
question. No, they don't survive. I mean, they don't die right away, though. They die 7 to 10 years later,
Right.
or 5 to 15 years later. It really depends on the tree. But, you know, if you damage that much of the root system, you're not going to have the tree survive. I just gave a lecture to a class very recently where I talked about trying to get people to, in landscape architecture, to not think about, oh, well, we need a clean slate. We need to get rid of everything and start fresh with a design, but to look at a site and say, okay, what's here that's good that I can save, and then working around that. Now, I understand that's tough when you're developing an area. You need to have equipment coming and going, but
And property rights, you know, people have strong feelings about property rights.
It is possible to build homes and preserve existing vegetation. You just have to think about how you're going to do that.
Mm-hmm.
We have a park in Newcastle County where the Curtis paper mill used to be. And for a number of years after the paper mill was knocked down, they just let vegetation come in, and a whole bunch of sycamore seedlings came up, and the landscape was kind of a mess. I mean, it wasn't attractive really, but there were a lot of really nice sycamores. Well, they just cut everything back down completely, seeded grass, put in pavement, and then they had to go back in and plant trees. They happened to plant a whole bunch of sycamores that have really struggled because they were added to the site after it was compacted. And if they had just judiciously saved the sycamores that came in on their own, they would have been way ahead of the game in having those desirable trees. So trying to pay attention to what exists and taking advantage of that is definitely a better way to go from an environmental perspective.
And one just last comment. I've thought, wouldn't it be nice if some students from Delaware came and targeted all those trees that are supposedly being saved, and having data about how long they do survive or don't survive? That would give us some information. But
That sounds like a great citizen science project. Doesn't have to be students. There are all kinds of people who could do that.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
Thank you also for the presentation. You've provided some really great resources. My question is, for those of us who might find that we need some guidance or assistance as we try to do some of this work, other than asking landscapers or master gardeners or whatever their philosophy and their approach, is there any way to identify anybody that really shares these values and approach? Is there, they've had a certain training or certification, or is it really just the process of talking to them?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I would suggest that as you look into, if you work with a landscaper, we do these types of educational sessions with the green industry all the time. So you really want to question those people and find out, do they know what they're doing? One of the big things that we also do as an extra certification is called Certified Nursery Professional, and Sue teaches those classes. Our volunteers get these classes as well. So there are, again, the Livable Ecosystem series, that as part of that Livable Delaware series is huge, but you can always call our office also if you have questions about that. I have a core group of volunteers that have been working with me the last 4 years in our meadow demonstration. And so they're very familiar. And so, and then I have other colleagues too that we can rely on. And if you want us to give a presentation somewhere to help with, you know, residents in your association, we can do that as well. Yeah. Yes.
I would just like to say one of the programs that I recommend that I took last year was the Delaware Master Naturalist Program. It's offered on a yearly basis, and it's a wonderful program to learn everything about the environment. And Dr. Barton is one of the lecturers involved in the program.
Yes. That's another part of our volunteer program at University of Delaware. My colleague Blake Moore, who I was with yesterday with Denrec, working in a group, he runs that. So yes, it's a wonderful program as well. Any other questions? Okay.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
This has been, yeah, really. This is fantastic, and Sue, thank you so much for making yourself available today and for those wonderful photos and all your advice. I mean, my head is spinning with all of the ideas I'm thinking about doing at my own place. So we really appreciate it. Very valuable, and the fact
you're most welcome. Thanks everyone for listening.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
And we have a number. They did bring a number of handouts, so please help yourself. Thank you for coming.
And if you have questions about taking a soil test or spotted lanternfly, happy to talk with you about it.